The bulk of the people in this industry would be happy to come back to work tomorrow if they could do it without fear of intimidation.
I've been a victim of the violence on the picket line. When I was hit by a police riot shield and put into hospital overnight, I've also been arrested on the picket line simply for walking down a pavement. So don't tell me about what's happening on picket lines. I understand it all too well. We're talking about our communities. We've got our lifetime invested in this industry, and we haven't got the balance sheet mentality of Mr. MacGregor, who only talks about the industry or the business. We're talking about an industry which employs human beings.
Mr. MacGregor.
The last thing we want to see is condemning people to obsolete operations which are bound to fail and are carried on at an enormous cost to all of the other citizens. What kind of selfishness is this?
Would you like to take your opportunity, take 2 minutes to tell us whether, in your view, the strike is cracking?
Well, Peter, I have here today a small statement to make. Every day that passes increases the suffering of those men and women who are employed by this industry but who are not at work. It increases the damage in those pits that haven't been working. In some cases, it's a good deal more than in the case of others. In some, however, the damage may soon go beyond our ability to recover the pit at a reasonable cost. It also increases and damages our prospects of increasing our markets, because it doesn't make customers feel very confident in placing their energy business with us. And in recent years, we've been trying very hard to attract new customers away from coal and away from oil back to coal. And this is a difficult thing for us to do in the face of the uncertainties of an industry that is beset with a long coal strike. It also increases the damage to our unions, damage which, unless their executives are careful, may also well become irreparable. Already, I see groups of miners forming who are working on their own interests away from the central idea of their union. It also increases the damage to the entire labor and trade union movement in Britain. There is dissatisfaction with some of the things that the leadership and the union have done. And I read in the media that this is a matter of distress to other trade unions.
A sort of live debate with the coal board since the beginning of the current dispute. And I therefore welcome this opportunity to challenge the National Coal Board's constant use of inaccurate figures. The coal board claim 114 pits are on strike. The NUM said the number is 130. Clearly, both cannot be right. I submit the union's figures are correct. They are unchallengeable, and that they prove the board's case on this question and others is both untenable and indefensible. It's true that throughout the dispute, the figures have fluctuated, with some men joining the strike, going back to work, and rejoining the strike. Nevertheless, 80% of our membership have remained solidly in support of the union's policy and out on strike. Throughout May and June, the coal board and the government claimed the strike was crumbling and miners returning to work in increasing numbers. Last month, the Energy Secretary, Peter Walker, the Prime Minister, on July the 3rd, said that 60,000 were now working in the mining industry. A figure again quoted by Giles Shaw, the Minister responsible for coal, on the 26th of July. I now note today the coal board have admitted that the number of miners going to work is only 134,000. In other words, conceding that the NUM's claim of 80% on strike is correct. If we take into account the coking plants and area workshops, the total membership on strike at the present time is about 157,000, a total which completely contradicts the National Coal Board's figure. For 24 weeks, our members have stayed solid in support of a fight to retain pits, jobs, and mining communities. I invite the board's representative, Mr. MacGregor, to begin this debate by conceding that the union's figure of 130 pits on strike and 80% of our members on strike is correct, because unless this fundamental point is cleared out of the way, this debate is academic and an empty exercise.
Well, that was exactly 2 minutes, Mr. Scargill. Thank you. Mr. MacGregor, you don't have to respond now to that question of Mr. Scargill's. Is there a question you would like to put to him which you consider completely pertinent?
Yes, I would like to ask Mr. Scargill when he is going to condemn the violence and intimidation which goes on every day in the areas of the pits.
Oh, Mr. MacGregor, I've condemned the violence by the thousands of police who've been brought in consistently throughout this dispute. But with respect, I think that many miners who are watching this programme want to hear about the dispute, what's behind it, and more important, whether your facts are right or mine.
Mr. MacGregor, is that answer satisfactory to you?
No, it isn't. Of course it isn't. As far as I am concerned, Mr. Scargill neatly tries to avoid the fact that a large number of people who appeared in picket lines have been arrested. And after these arrests, they've been in front of the magistrates who found them guilty of certain misdemeanors. And he talks about the police being violent. I think we've got to get ourselves focused on this problem. We would have a very large percentage of our workers back at work today were it not for the fact that this violence is going on. It goes far beyond any normal industrial arrangements. The trade union movement has a code which I understand limits picketing to 6 people at an individual pit. This number has been exceeded, and at almost every one of the pits where we've seen violence, the numbers have gone far beyond that.
Mr. Scargill, would you care to answer that point before you put your question to Mr. MacGregor?
Very quickly, the trade union movement do not have a limit on the number of pickets at any particular pit or industry. That was during the last Tory government's industrial relations bill when the TUC made a recommendation. But quite frankly, the limit as far as the trade union movement is concerned has been very widely observed as far as the Yorkshire miners in particular are concerned, because there have been hardly any pickets at all until the massive amounts of money that have been spent by the National Coal Board busing or attempting to bus certain people into work with thousands of police on duty. What we're saying very simply is that this debate tonight should be about the issues and trying to resolve this strike. That's what I want to do, settle the dispute.
Is there a question you would like to put directly to Mr. MacGregor now?
Yes, there is. This debate came about because of the constant use of figures by the coal board saying that 60,000 people were working in the mining industry or 50,000 people were working and only 114 pits were on strike. Now, I challenged Mr. MacGregor in my opening to deny that 130 pits are on strike, and I know that he's got a copy of our press release naming every pit. And secondly, that we've got 146 or 7,000 miners on strike at pits, and as I indicated during my opening, considerably more than that, 157,000 if you count coking plants and, of course, ancillary workers as well. I want to know whether Mr. MacGregor concedes that my figures on this are correct.
No, they aren't. Of course they aren't. You know that as well as I do. We have 49,400 NUM members at work at the present moment, plus some 3,400 men engaged in safety work. We have at the present moment 45 pits working normally, and we have seen a steady increase in the number of pits at which some people have turned up this week. 11 in particular. 201 men returned to work this week alone so far.
Is that answer satisfactory, Mr.
No,
Scargill?
it isn't. Of course it isn't. The fact is, Mr. Sissons, that in Yorkshire we have 56 pits all on strike. South Wales, 28 pits all on strike. Scotland, 13 pits all on strike. Durham, 12 pits all on strike. Northumberland, 5 pits all on strike. Derbyshire, 8 pits all on strike. Kent, 3 pits all on strike. In the northwestern area, there are 4 pits on strike, and in North Wales, 1 on strike. And the total manpower that is out of work at the present time involved in this dispute is in the region, in the pits, certainly of 147,000. There's no question about that whatsoever. And obviously, if one looks at the areas that are reputed to be working, even if they were all working, the figure could not possibly reach that quoted by Mr. MacGregor. But what he hasn't done is answer the question. In the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, quoting coal board figures, said on the 3rd of July, 60,000 were working in that period. Now, even if Mr. MacGregor's figure's right, it means that there are now fewer working than there were then. But incidentally, also, Mr. Giles Shaw said in June, on the 7th, in response to a question by Mr. Tony Benn, that there were only 19% to 25% working in the mining industry. And if one works that figure out, of course, you can see that there's been a dramatic change.
I think we should interrupt Mr. Scargill's monologue.
Well, Mr. MacGregor, would you care to put your point of view?
Well, what he is reciting is not correct at all. We have, at the present moment, got all of the pits in Leicestershire, in Nottingham, in what we call the West Midlands area. In Lancashire, the bulk of the pits are working. In Scotland, we are seeing a steady return to work. As Mr. Scargill pointed out, in North Wales, we have one pit working, the main pit there. And in addition to that, I spent yesterday at the pit in Warwickshire, where almost the total enrollment has been at work almost ever since the strike began. We have 49,400 members of the NUM at work, plus all of the supporting cast from other unions. And the figures that have been quoted in Parliament include all of these people.
Well, we've heard the figures from both sides. I think our viewers will make their own judgment. Could we move on, Mr. MacGregor, and ask you whether on the basis of the information available to you, you would claim that the strike is crumbling?
There's no question about it. I get a great deal of information from our managers in the area. I get a great deal of correspondence from the people who work for the NCB. And from that, we have calculated that at least 75% of the people not working would like to go back to strike, to work immediately and stop this strike. One of the things that interests me is that most of the correspondence insists that we try to encourage Mr. Scargill to have a ballot. I believe that that is probably the correct solution to the problem, and I would challenge Mr. Scargill to ask his members what they think about the strike.
Arthur Scargill.
Well, first of all, let me repeat, Mr. Sissons, and very briefly repeat and then move on, that the figures put forward by Mr. MacGregor simply don't make sense.
Well,
in fact, no, I'm sorry. In fact, if you look at it, the number of pits out on strike is 130, and the total manpower employed at those pits is, in fact, around 147,000.
I think we could go around the houses on that all night, Mr. Scargill.
All right, but Mr.
Could you deal with the point that
yes,
the allegation that 75% of your members would go back to work if they were given the chance?
Well, of course, Mr. MacGregor attempts to be a barometer about what's happening in the National Union of Mineworkers. All I can say is that every single opinion poll that's been conducted, including, I understand, one conducted some 3 weeks ago by a television company, suggested that by 4 to 1 they support the miners' policy of opposing Mr. MacGregor's butchery, which he practiced so viciously in British Steel when he closed down massive numbers of jobs in that industry. And secondly, of course, as far as we are concerned, we run our union democratically. If we decide that we want a ballot, we'll have one. In Yorkshire, they had a ballot, and 86% of the membership decided they would strike if someone like Mr. MacGregor came on the scene and tried to close pits, other than in line with a signed agreement called Plan for Coal. Now, we've said throughout this dispute that we want to adhere strictly to the Plan for Coal. It's a signed agreement between the government, Coal Board and Union. Mr. MacGregor won't do that.
You've made a number of points there. Mr. MacGregor, would you care to answer?
Well, you've only got a minute, as I told you. All I can say is that I disagree totally with Mr. Scargill's figures. I again reiterate that the thing to do is for him to ask his members what they want to do. I have every indication that the bulk of them want to go back to work. The only reason they're not there is because his bully boys continue to intimidate them and their families. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm perfectly satisfied that the bulk of the people in this industry would be happy to come back to work tomorrow if they could do it without fear of intimidation.
Mr. Scargill, I've heard say that he sees no violence from his members.
Mr. Scargill is not looking at your television programs, and he isn't following the reports in the media. Let me just point out to you that in the last few weeks, we have seen an increasing number of people arrested, and they have been engaged in violence.
Do you not see these scenes on television, Mr. Scargill?
Well, of course, I see the kind of scenes that you portray on television. All too rarely, unfortunately, do I see scenes like the one at Orgreave, where you saw a police officer beating an unarmed picket to the ground. But, you know, I've been a victim of the violence on the picket line. When I was hit by a police riot shield and put into hospital overnight, I've also been arrested on a picket line simply for walking down a pavement. So don't tell me about what's happening on picket lines. I understand it all too well.
Is it not a crime to throw stones at policemen?
I would suggest that it's a crime, as Mr. MacGregor has put forward his plan, to destroy 20,000 jobs and close 20 pits. That's why my members are involved in an action to try and save this industry. If Mr. MacGregor had as much faith in this industry as I have,
a lot of time because we don't propose to fire 20,000 people. You know as well as I do that what we have told these people is this, that nobody need go out of this industry who doesn't want to do so. And those that do want to stay and have a job in the industry will have every opportunity to have one. And this story about 20,000 that you keep repeating, Mr. Scargill, is totally false. And all I can say is we know how many people are working today because we pay them and we have the payroll information. And anytime anyone in the public wants to see them, we will show them to them.
Mr. Scargill, are you misrepresenting what's on offer from the coal board?
Not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. You will notice that Mr. MacGregor once again neatly turned the question away from the loss of jobs and talked about those already working. I'm talking about the sons and daughters of miners who have a right to have a job in this industry. We're talking about our communities. We've got our lifetime invested in this industry, and we haven't got the balance sheet mentality of Mr. MacGregor, who only talks about the industry or the business. We're talking about an industry which employs human beings.
Mr. MacGregor.
The only opportunity that these people will have in the future is to work in pits that are reasonably equipped and are reasonably efficient, and that's what I have promised to give the industry. The last thing we want to see is condemning people to obsolete operations which are bound to fail and are carried on at an enormous cost to all of the other citizens. What kind of selfishness is this? You talk about the jobs for your sons and daughters and grandchildren. What about the people today who are losing jobs because our energy costs are much too high and non-competitive? Well, Mr. Sissons, I want to thank you for the opportunity of talking in this program, and I want to say good night.
Well, we have another couple of minutes on the time agreed, Mr. MacGregor. If you'd care to say, to make a final statement.
Mr. Sissons, I think it should be made clear that Mr. MacGregor and the Coal Board attempted to censor this programme before we started and did indicate that after about 15 minutes he would walk out. And you did agree that you would continue to allow me to put the case that I originally intended to put, showing that we are the most competitive coal industry in the world in terms of deep mining, when you take into account all the factors, including subsidies. I also wanted the opportunity, and I hope that I'm going to get it, to put the case for the NUM, but more important, to ask Mr. MacGregor, before he finally disappears, why, when we've got an appointed and agreed mediator, who came with a formulation to me and to Mr. MacGregor to try and settle this dispute, we didn't exactly want to say those formal words, but we said to Stan Orme, the shadow spokesman on energy, that we would accept the formulation that he put forward. He took that formulation, which we agreed would form the basis of negotiation, back to Mr. MacGregor 3 weeks ago. There's been no response from Mr. MacGregor, and it appears that he's more interested in trying to defeat this union than settle this costly and damaging dispute, not only to the nation, but to the miners that I represent.
Thank you, Mr. Scargill. Mr. MacGregor, a very important point that you're only interested in prolonging the dispute and defeating the union. Would you care to reply to that?
All I can say is that that's a lot of balderdash, and it's quite typical of Mr. Scargill's misrepresentations. Mr. Orme has, and I'm sorry that he's been sick and in the hospital, and I wish that he would be quickly restored to health. But he did come around to try to find some solution to the problem, but he came up with nothing that would help the situation. And he admitted that he could get nothing out of Mr. Scargill.
Mr. Sissons, I've been talking to Mr. Orme today before I came on this programme, and he agreed that I had the right to put this to Mr. MacGregor or Mr. Smith. Now, I have put this question to him. Here was a formulation of words agreed with a mediator, put to me. We accepted it reluctantly, but we accepted it in an attempt to get a settlement to this very damaging dispute. That was put to Mr. MacGregor 3 weeks ago. He hasn't even replied.
Mr. MacGregor, I'm going to, if you care to deal with that point.
I'll tell you why I haven't replied, because it was never put to me.
Mr. MacGregor and Mr. Scargill, we are going to wrap up this debate shortly, in the next minute or so. Could I ask you both, as the general public looks at you and hears that you have no common ground whatsoever, what are we to make of it? Mr. MacGregor...
I would be happy to respond to that. I have common ground with the people who work in the mining industry. I want to see them succeed. I want to see them obtain increased job opportunities, but that can only be done as we improve the efficiency of this business and find markets for our products. We cannot continue to run this business on a subsidy which every taxpayer pays for. We've got to find a way to stand on our own feet. And speaking about deep mined costs, in Europe the costs are higher than they are in this country, and the industries are enormously subsidized. But in Germany, they're starting to decline. That industry is starting to contract very rapidly because of its high costs. In Holland, it's already closed. In Belgium, it's been cut in half in the last few years. In France, it's been cut in half. And even though Mr. Mitterrand hoped when he went to office that he could expand the coal industry, he's now decided that it's too expensive. He's got to see that it is contracted. Here in this country, we have a chance to make our industry into a low-cost, high-volume industry if we just work at it. Let me give you an example.
Briefly,
We sell coal to the Central Electricity Generating Board in bulk at 46 pounds a ton delivered to their plants. The utility companies in the eastern part of the United States, which is the industrial heartland of the US, buy it at 23 pounds a ton. The industries, therefore, that get electricity from these utilities in the US get it at half the cost that our companies do in this country. And that's why we put everybody else's job at hazard.
Mr. MacGregor, very briefly, can there ever be any common ground between you and Arthur Scargill?
I have common ground with the people who work in this industry. I want to see them succeed. Now, if Arthur wants to come aboard, fine.
Arthur Scargill, a final word from you. I did give Mr. MacGregor the first word, so yours is the final word, but could you keep it reasonably short?
Well, with respect, you gave him quite a word there. I've been aboard this industry ever since I was 15 years of age, not for some 9 months destroying it like Mr. MacGregor. But let me say this. The subsidies given in Europe amount to something between £33 a tonne and £102 per tonne given by those governments, and in communist Poland about £50 or £60 per tonne. Here in Britain we get hardly anything whatsoever. Now I want to make it clear to people watching this programme that this dispute was created because Mr. MacGregor announced a pit closure programme. That programme is in violation of this agreement, the plan for coal. Now Mrs. Thatcher has said in Parliament she approved that plan for coal. The coal boards say they approve the plan for coal. The NUM said they agree with the plan for coal. I invite Mr. MacGregor to withdraw his pit closure plan, which he wanted to take 4 million tonnes out of this industry. We've already taken 14 times out as a result of the dispute. Let's get back to work on the basis of plan for coal, a signed agreement between the coal board government and the union. I would have thought that that was a reasonable proposition to put to anybody. How on earth can you argue against a signed agreement that the Prime Minister, the Chairman of the Coal Board and the President of the NUM all say they agree with? I'll tell you why. Because the Coal Board want to depart from the plan for coal and close pits down in order to succeed in their policy of getting towards newer pits with fewer men and destroying about 70,000 jobs in the longer term.
There's only one thing I could say, Mr. Sisson, and thank you for putting us on this program together. In conclusion, I would suggest that Arthur read the plan for coal, because in it says that inefficient pits will be eliminated and new capacity will be the subject of investment.
That's not true, Mr. MacGregor.
Of course it is true. You read it carefully.
Well, you show me the paragraph, Mr. MacGregor, and I'll read it.
I will. I'll be glad to any time.
We'll do it on this programme.
Arthur Scargill, Ian MacGregor, thank you both very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.